Hello there, everyone. Hope you can hear me okay. My name is David May. Welcome to the final spring webinar on mentoring presented by the National Mentoring Community. The National Mentoring Community, or NMC, if you don't know, is a program of the American Physical Society, APS, and it aims to help provide support to undergraduate physics students who are from racial and ethnic minority groups as they make their way to degree completion. Again, my name is David May. I'm the program manager for the National Mentoring Community, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Thanks very much for joining us. First, I would like to introduce our speaker for the webinar, Dr. Christine Fund. Chris is the director of CIMR, the Center for the Improvement of Mentored Experiences in Research. She's also the PI and director of the Mentor Training Corps, which is part of the National Research Mentoring Network. And she's an associate scientist at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. Chris is going to present the webinar in a mixture of formats. She will present a traditional slideshow, but also pause several times to get feedback from all of you. We'd like this to be as interactive as we can make it. So of course, you'll be able to ask questions and answer some questions. So real quick, to help you interact with her at these times, here's a brief rundown of what you can expect. You should all have a window that looks something like this and is titled GoToWebinar Control Panel. You may have to make the GoToWebinar the frontmost program on your computer in order to see it. But we'll be using two of those drop-down boxes, the one for questions and the one called poll. The questions box is going to be our main chat box. It's the main way you'll communicate with Chris and with me. When Chris asks a question that requires a short response, you can type it in the questions box and we'll see it. You can also ask questions at any time during the webinar by typing them into the box, and Chris and I will see them and answer them either by typing back or Chris will speak her answer. Next, for multiple choice questions, we'll be using the poll function, which works like this. So for those of you who haven't been on it, I'm going to run you through a really quick test poll, a practice run. So please give an answer to any of these 5 questions you see on the screen. Chris is going to start the poll now. What are you looking forward to in the next month? End of semester, completing a project, vacation, family celebration, or other. Please click one of those responses. Looks like we got 90% of you have voted, which is great. And Chris can end the poll now and share the results with you. All right. I'm looking forward to both of those things as well. Great. So I hope this helps you get the most out of the webinar. Just so you know, a link to a recording of today's webinar will be put on the NMC website after today's event. And you'll also get an email with links to that and to other resources that'll be on the NMC website, including the slides that Chris will show you. So I'll have another announcement at the end, but for now, I'll hand it over to Chris to begin the presentation. So Chris, take it away.
Great, thank you, David, and thanks to all of you for taking an hour out of your day to engage in this webinar and hopefully to gain some new resources and knowledge to help optimize your current or future mentoring practice. So for those of you who this is your first webinar, I want to spend just a couple minutes getting to know who's in the room and doing a little then recap of the previous webinars. And then today we're going to be focused on assessing understanding, equity and inclusion, and aligning expectations. And as a reminder, this is the final of a 3-webinar series. There's no prerequisite to have attended the first 2 to be able to optimally learn from this one. But just to let you know that all 3 webinars will be posted on the community website that David mentioned and will draw your attention to. So as an introductory activity, we'd like to get a sense of who's here today. We can see your names in the system, but we don't know where you're currently working. So if you would be willing to type into the question window your institution or organization, it'll give us a sense of where everybody's from. So we'll give you just a minute to do that. Great, so we have someone from Gustavus Adolphus, Pacific University in Oregon, Trinity College, Rowan University, Central Connecticut State, University of Dallas, AIP, Shippensburg University. I'm not even sure where that is. Interesting. Shahid Sharm. I hope I'm saying that right. University of Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras. Great. So folks from all over the place. Wonderful. Oh, Istanbul Technical University. Wonderful. And someone from the Institute for Plasma Research in India. And oh, Shippensburg's in Pennsylvania. Thank you for clarifying that. I'll have to look for it on a map. Great, well, welcome everyone. And it's wonderful, we're all working at diverse places, and that will hopefully add to sharing from those diverse perspectives in this webinar. So we'd also like to know what career stage you're at. And so again, if you can use the poll, which I'll launch here in a second. So again, you can use that polling window and the poll's open, and let us know what career stage you're at. And if none of these apply, there is an other category as well. All right, thanks. 94% of you have voted, and so we have about 65% of your faculty and some postdocs and grad students. And some folks from the other category as well, and you're welcome to share with us in the question window what other category you are, just so we have a sense of what that is. All right, and then I'd also like to get a sense of how many mentees you're currently mentoring. And again, for folks who attended one of the other webinars, we're repeating these questions, but I think it's important in every webinar to have a sense of who we're speaking to and sharing with. So again, here's another poll, is how many mentees are you currently mentoring? And if you're not mentoring anyone right now, that's absolutely fine. We hope that what we share with you today is applicable to your future practice. Great, and Arlene, thanks for saying that you're a diversity professional, and that was what was in the other category. All right, so I'm going to share these results. Looks like we have about a third of folks, or quarter, 2 or more mentees, some mentoring 3, a quarter 4, and about a third of the folks are not currently mentoring anyone. So a lot of diversity in terms of our current mentoring load. So for those of you who are currently mentoring, what are the career stages of the folks that you are mentoring? And let me start that poll. There we go. All right, so of those who are currently mentoring, most of you are mentoring undergraduates, and that will be a major focus of the topics and materials we're sharing with you today. But for the quarter of you who are mentoring more than one of those, what we ask you to do is certainly take from these conversations best practices for mentoring undergrads, but that really these are straightforward types of skills that can absolutely be extrapolated across career stages. And certainly we have resources that can be used in that capacity. All right, so I'm going to hide the poll, and wanted to the benefit of folks who were not able to be at the first 2 webinars to just give you a little sense of what we talked about. So the first webinar was really focused on communication and specifically providing feedback. So we focused on culture and communications, on building your mentees' research self-efficacy, and we talked a lot about resources for communication and improving your practice. Again, that webinar is posted on the community website, as well as some of the resources we discussed. The second webinar last month focused on fostering independence, on fostering a growth mindset and really personal factors, including mental health, that can affect mentees and your relationship with them. Again, all those are posted at the link below, which will be shared with you by David via email. So to give us a little bit of an umbrella, and again, I have a couple slides here repeated from the previous webinars, but I want to make sure we're all on the same page, is just a reminder that there's quite a building and growing literature showing that a mentored research experience and strong mentorship has been linked to many outcomes. This includes enhanced research identity, sense of belonging, and self-efficacy. It has been linked to persistence, research productivity, higher career satisfaction, and the enhancement of recruitment and retention of folks from traditionally underrepresented groups. And here I have a lot of resources and references that you can tap into, both for your own practice, but also as you're thinking about grant writing and program support that really wants to argue for the importance of mentoring. Now, when we say mentoring, really what we are defining that as is a collaborative learning relationship that proceeds through purposeful stages over time and has the primary goal of helping mentees acquire the competencies they need to succeed in their chosen career. And this is going to require you as a mentor to guide them through an experience that requires personal and intellectual growth and development. And so mentoring can be applied in the research context, to career coaching, peer mentoring, even virtual mentoring. In some cases, it can even apply to advising, as long as it's not a one-way giving of advice. Again, that collaborative learning relationship element is important. And there are many skills that are known to affect research mentoring relationships. Here is a framework that we recently published focusing the skill areas in research skill development, which as mentors, most of us are very good at teaching people skills and knowledge of our field. There's also elements of interpersonal skills. These have to do with aligning expectations and active listening, communication, which we touched upon in the previous webinar. There's a whole domain of psychosocial skills. These include building self-efficacy and motivation, which we touched upon previously. And then a whole element of cultural and diversity-focused skills. Today we'll spend a little bit time talking about advancing equity and inclusion. And finally, there are many domain skills in sponsorship, which include fostering independence and promoting professional development and being an advocate for your mentees. An important thing here that I like to note is that we don't expect every mentor to play each of these roles for every mentee. First, not every mentee needs all of these roles fulfilled at any one time. And secondly, we really encourage mentees to have multiple mentors so that the roles that they need filled can be filled by multiple people. So in partnership with the National Research Mentoring Network, which is funded by NIH, NSF-funded initiatives, Howard Hughes-funded initiatives, we and a cadre of partners have developed mentor and mentee training interventions. And this is just a compilation of many of those, many of which have been published, websites. They include things that are implemented face-to-face. There are things that are implemented online that are self-paced. And there are synchronous online training venues like webinars like today, as well as facilitator training workshops so that folks can use these materials and implement them in their own organizations and institutions. And a little bit of the curriculum that you'll be experiencing today comes in particular from Entering Mentoring, which is one of the facilitated process-based curricula that we have developed and tested. Excuse me. We have done a lot of study of these interventions that are aimed at optimizing mentoring relationships, and we have published on that those results. And so here is a list of publications that may be of interest. So today we're going to focus on 3 competencies. The first is assessing understanding. So in assessing understanding, what I mean by that is how do you really figure out when your mentee, and in particular this case, when your undergraduate mentees really understand something. So I'd like to start with a case study that's called It Just Didn't Work. And well, I'm going to read the case study here, and you'll be able to read it along as well on the screen. And then in the questions box, I'm going to ask you to please share one approach you could use to figure out what's going wrong, as described in this case. So I have a really promising undergraduate mentee. He's getting great grades in all of his classes, and when we work through experiments together, he knows all the right techniques. But he doesn't seem to be able to get experiments to work right when he's by himself. I'm trying to help him figure out what's happening in his failed experiments, but our conversations all seem to go like this. So what happened with the experiment? It didn't work. What happened? Nothing. It just didn't work. But what do you think went wrong? I don't know. But I tried it twice and it didn't work either time. We're both getting a little frustrated with the lack of progress, and he's been coming to lab less and less often. How do I get things back on the right track? So I invite you in the questions box to share one approach you could use to figure out what is going on here. And we'll give you just a couple minutes till we get a couple suggestions on what approaches could be used to figure out what's going on. In addition, you certainly can suggest approaches that you could use to help assess understanding here in a different way than just asking why it didn't work. Great, so Stephanie has said, ask him to write down his process in detail while he's performing it. Yes, good grades are not necessarily what makes a good experimentalist. And that's something to consider. That was certainly the case for me as an undergrad. Ask him for notes, ask the student to document, coming up with some intermediate results so you can check along the way, not wait till the end. Thanks, Nathan, that's a great suggestion. Has he tried to teach someone else? So a very nice technique is, we all know that we can figure out what we don't know when we try to teach someone else. Being available to answer questions in real time, also very helpful. A gift. So Darsa's suggesting, Arlene, consider having him work with another student who's stronger in this area. And yeah, so that near-peer mentoring can really be useful here, and it can be really beneficial to both this undergrad mentee as well as the senior student. Darsa said, ask him what he expects should happen. So that's very interesting too. Does he even know what the expected outcome would look like if it did work? And would he notice it if it happened? Just observing. Yeah, we can learn a lot as mentors by just watching somebody and see what happens when they're doing the work. Don't intervene, but just observe. Obviously, that can make students a little nervous. So also just telling them, I'm just going to watch and see if I can figure out what's going wrong or what's also going right by just watching what you're doing. So great. Thank you so much. These are great suggestions. And I think collectively you can see across the suggestions made that there are a lot of ways that we can try to really assess understanding. One of the things that is most often helpful to remember is simply to not ask yes/no questions or not let someone off the hook with an answer that doesn't give you any information. The goal here is to help figure out what the student understands and what's working and not. And so the responses they're currently giving with the questions that were asked is not getting you to be able to understand that, nor can the student understand that. So one of the things that we'd like to invite you to consider is, what are some of the reasons that can explain a mentee having difficulty understanding? And these you don't have to answer in the question window, but just to consider. And how can you help your mentee accurately assess their own understanding? And you had some good suggestions. And one thing I wanted to raise is that we do unconsciously make assumptions about abilities and levels of understanding based on other cues and factors. And these can include race, ethnicity, gender, English fluency, prior experience and background, and the types of questions someone asks, or even their willingness to ask questions. And so one of the things in assessing understanding that I think it's important to remember as mentors is how do we acknowledge those assumptions and remain open-minded about the potential a student has. That in the case study described, that we don't come away from that assuming the student isn't capable, but more that we check our assumptions and say, okay, let's get down to the bottom of where the difficulty is happening. Let's try some approaches and see if we can circumvent this and see if we can get the student to understand better and be able to, in this case, accomplish the experiment. But I think it's important to raise it is that we often make some assumptions even when we're not sure where the issue is happening. So what I've included today is I've compiled a list from many prior mentor training workshop participants across the country with some of their best suggestions in terms of assessing understanding approaches. Some of them parallel some of the great suggestions you made in the questions window. And so I'll just point out a couple here is that are different from what was shared in the questions window. So asking a mentee to explain it back to you. Some folks suggested they write it. You can also have them verbally do it. One of my favorite is actually having them draw it or draw a flow chart. I'm a visual learner, so it's really helpful. I know that if I can draw something, I really understand it. Again, asking open-ended questions. Asking a mentee to use the language to explain something else or to come up with a metaphor. What is this like? How do they put it in their own framework? Excuse me, I have a little bit of a sore throat. Also just sharing your own experiences with the mentee about trying something new so they don't feel the pressure to perform. A lot of times, a lot of mistakes can get made simply because they're so new to this and they feel so much pressure to perform. And stressing that there really are no dumb questions, that you encourage them to ask questions if they're confused, even if they walk away from an explanation and think of it later that day or a couple days later, to come back and ask those questions because you're invested in them truly learning. One of the things I think working with undergrads that it's easy to forget is that they don't really often have a framework for the kinds of new things they're learning. So you may have heard of the term expert novice blind spot. And what this refers to is that as experts, we fill in so many of the gaps because of our prior knowledge. And as novices, we don't yet have a framework in order to work with, and we're not able to fill that in. One of the classic examples that's used is expert chess players can look at a chessboard and they know exactly what series of moves are going to occur in the next couple moves, if not the whole game, depending on all of the circumstances. They have a framework for the game. They don't have to think move by move. They can see patterns. They have a mental framework in which to make those decisions. When you're a novice, what you see is a board in pieces. You might think of one next move, but you don't have a framework for how to make those decisions. Oftentimes when students are starting with us in the lab or in the field, they don't have a framework for the new knowledge. And so they're attaching it onto things that are most close to it. And that's often classwork. And the point that was made in the questions window is important, is that being strong in their classes doesn't necessarily mean that the same framework will work in their experiments. And so helping them build a framework in which they can lay methods and experimental procedures on and understanding them is a really important part of the process we as mentors can be part of. So I'll pause there just for a minute and see if there's any questions just on assessing understanding, thinking about our assumptions about ability when they don't understand, and approaches that we can use to help us better assess understanding and help our students assess their own understanding and grow. And if not, that's absolutely fine. I'll pause at each of the competencies in case there are questions. All right, so one of the things that I wanted to point to you is that we have developed with partners an entire curriculum for undergraduates to help them in their research skill development. And this is a facilitator's manual to implement some of these activities to help mentees. And we actually offer regularly facilitator training workshops to implement these activities with our trainees. That can be just in your lab, that could be in your department, in your program. So this link will be shared with you both in these slides as well as separately when David posts these resources on the website. There's an offer to have access to all of these materials and to give feedback on them if you try them. And so these can include things like tools for assessing skill development. They'll also include things like undergraduate mentoring compacts, which I'll share with you later in the webinar. So the next topic we wanted to spend just a couple minutes on is equity and inclusion. So this is an important element in thinking about working with students across different dimensions of diversity. So one that obviously we are tending to in this network is race and ethnicity, but aspects of identity including gender, sexual orientation, ability status, socioeconomic status, and many other elements of identity can really impact the mentoring relationship. And it's something that we as mentors don't often talk about, and yet it has profound implications on the folks we're working with. So I wanted to start with this case study to kind of just raise the issue where many of us sit in terms of talking about issues of difference. So the case says that last summer I worked with a fantastic undergraduate mentee. She was very intelligent and generated a fair amount of data. I think that she had a positive summer research experience, but there are a few things that still linger in my mind. This particular mentee was an African-American woman from a small town. I wondered how she felt on a big urban campus. I also wondered how she felt about being the only African-American woman in our lab. In fact, she was the only African-American woman in the entire department that summer. I wondered how the white majority environment might impact her experience. I wanted to ask her how she felt, but I worried it might be insensitive or politically incorrect to do so. I never asked. I still wonder how she felt and how those feelings may have affected her experience. So what I'd like to ask you is, based on this case, is just to get us started, and again, just be honest, there's no right or wrong answer here. It's simply question is, would you ask about this? And I've opened a poll. All right. So what I'm sharing with you here are the answers. We have a percentage of folks saying they definitely ask. We have a large percentage of folks asking, say they would ask if they knew the mentee well. So there's a certain degree of familiarity and trust that might have to be established first. Some folks saying they wouldn't ask, but if the mentee raised it, they'd be willing to have that conversation. And the last option is some folks feeling just unsure what they would do. So I appreciate folks being honest about their answers. I use this case because in our training, what we found across mentors across the country is this is a tough issue, but this is at its heart what it's about, is that somebody's identity, regardless of what identities are salient to them, does affect their experience as an undergraduate researcher. It affects how they experience the environment. It affects their relationships. Some feel that they are trying to ignore the impacts it's having because they don't want certain aspects of their identity being overlapped or overlaid on their ability. Others feel like they have to check their identity at the door, that they can't bring it into the lab or into the institution because it's something that they should not pay attention to and should not be a factor. And yet when they walk out the door, it's very salient to them in the rest of their life. And so when we talk to mentees across the country, and my colleagues and I have an R01 to study exactly this, what we find is that most mentees actually do want to talk about elements of their identity, but they know that their mentors are uncomfortable doing so, and they also feel pressure that they don't want to be the one to bring it up. And we also have a lot of mentors who would like to talk about these issues but feel uncomfortable doing so, or feel that there has to be a certain amount of rapport in order to do it. What I will tell you is there's no right or wrong answer. But what I encourage you to think about is, as a mentor, is to make this an intentional decision. That to not be colorblind if it's issues of race and ethnicity, not be blind to identities and the impact they have, but to consider within your own practice that a mentee's identities might be impacting their experience, and that you may want to look for opportunities to have that conversation if you're comfortable doing so. That could be just listening and waiting for opportunities for the mentee to bring something up that you could then pursue. It might mean bringing it up because you're in the position of power of saying, are there aspects of the environment, of the department, of the experience that are impacting you? Are there aspects of your identity that you feel a better sense of belonging in terms of doing this work here in this institution than other elements of your identity? So there are a lot of kind of neutral conversation starters that can raise these topics. Not every mentee wants to talk about them, but many more mentees than you might think really do want to have the opportunity to talk about the challenges they have, especially if they are the only or the other in an environment, and how that impacts their experience. So some questions that we'd like you to consider in terms of this case is, what might be the mentor's intent have been in asking the question, and what might be the impact on the mentee? So I invite you in the questions box to answer either of these questions. What would your intent be in asking the question, but what might the impact be on the mentee, either positive or negative? I'll give you a minute to respond to that. Let me hide this poll. Give folks just a minute. Maybe we can get at least 3 or 4 people to respond in terms of, again, the intent of asking a question about a student's identity and how it impacts their experience, and the impact that it might have on the mentee, either positive or negative. Thank you, Carmen. So Carmen Wright is saying, asking helps you understand what the problem or issues are. And Stephanie says the intent would be to see if I could help make the environment more conducive, perhaps talking to other people to get a support network. Levent said building trust, feeling valuable. I'd like to raise the value. I think oftentimes these issues get raised when we see problems, but what I'd also like to invite you to think about is, often if we don't invite these conversations, we miss opportunities, we miss learning, and we miss seeing the value that these perspectives bring as well. Certainly making others more comfortable. Thank you, Michael, and helping the future. Nathan says, want to indicate that you're aware of differences and they can be important, and that your perceived comfort level in raising the topic would be the biggest factor. And I think that that's an important thing. Is it's also, I think, invite you to consider that it's also okay to say, I realize that certain elements of your identity might impact your experience. It's not a topic I have a lot of practice in talking about, but I want you to know I'm open to discussing it. Sometimes just the invitation and just the acknowledgement that you don't have to necessarily ask it perfectly, but being willing to have that conversation, but sharing the fact that it's not something that you do every day or that you're the most comfortable doing. Darcy's saying she talks to a lot of students of color on campus and they hate it when people say they don't see color. Yeah, and there's actually a lot of literature saying that trying to take a colorblind approach actually backfires. There's actually a physiological response to trying to ignore issues of identity, especially race and ethnicity and gender, when you try to pretend you don't see it. Yeah, so there's a lot of concern, as Michael raises, about the intent being misunderstood. And I think that's absolutely fair. And again, one of the safest things you can do is actually just owning that and saying, I want you to know that this is my intent. My intent is to better understand and to make this a productive, successful experience for you. And I, invite to have that conversation with you if it's something that would be helpful. And if it's not helpful, then I'm also want to respect that. A lot of self-education, Arlene, I'm really glad you brought that up, is it's really, really important to do a lot of self-work. In terms of thinking about assumptions, bias, learning about differences, how to value differences, that this isn't just about mentees who come from different backgrounds educating us, who happen to come from majority backgrounds. At least that's mine, and I'm using the collective us for myself. Obviously, I can't see you in this webinar, so I can't make any assumptions about your identities. And even if I could see you, I could only see those identities that are visible. And there's many hidden identities that mentees can choose or not choose, as well as mentors to share. Darsa's suggesting the book, yep, so you want to talk about race, which is a really fantastic book in terms of our own self-education. Thank you. So this is just obviously scratching the surface on a conversation like this. But when thinking about mentoring students, and especially undergraduates, and especially in this day and age right now, at this moment in time, there's a lot of conversation and a lot of emotion when we talk about issues of identity, especially race and ethnicity. And that is the environment in which our mentees are living. And so we invite you as mentors to really do some self-work and to think intentionally about the impact these identity aspects might have on your mentee, and whether or not that is a conversation you're willing to engage in, or at least willing to look for opportunities to engage in. So I want to leave you, before we move on to the last topic today, is in the questions, in thinking about this particular case, and sorry, this is the equity inclusion case, is how you might react differently to this case if the mentee's difference was one of sexual orientation. And how do you engage in these conversations based on interest without sounding judgmental about difference? And how do you ask about raising issues without raising issues of tokenism? So I ask these questions because obviously these are things which play into our own concern about entering into the conversation. What bias do I bring? Am I being judgmental without realizing it? Am I asking somebody to have to speak for a certain group and putting them in a position of having to speak for that group, or an issue of tokenism? These are all very important things to think about, but we also don't want them to become paralyzing. I think the other thing is to also be honest with ourselves about which elements of identity we're comfortable talking about and which ones we're not. If I was to have written the case and simply been about the fact that it was about a woman and she happened to be the only woman in the department, would you be much more willing to talk about gender than you would about race, ethnicity, or about ability or disability status? And why? And what is that telling you about your own comfort? Again, not in any kind of judgmental way, but it's an important emotional and intellectual exercise to identify where our own comfort is and where that comes from and what we can do in order to challenge that within ourselves. So these are just some questions for you to consider on your own time, since we have such a short time together, which might help you in terms of your own reflective practice. So the last thing that we wanted to share with you today is talking about aligning expectations. Aligning expectations turns out to be one of the places in terms of mentoring relationships where with very little change in practice, you can see huge outcomes. It's also where we can get really tripped up in the relationship if expectations are not clear and they're not aligned. So I want to introduce the concept of mentoring compacts. And what do I mean by that? So by mentoring compacts, it's just really a written document used to articulate expectations between mentors and mentees or protege. It differs from an individual development plan, which we actually talked about on the first webinar, which really focuses on long and short-term career plans. This compact is focused on expectations for the working relationship on a regular basis, and compacts vary in their levels of format and detail. So the rationale is that it provides a written documentation of expectations which can be revisited and revised over time. And it really serves as a shared reference point for regular progress reviews. And importantly, it makes invisible expectations visible. It really levels the playing field. So oftentimes what we hear from mentees is they say, I don't know what's expected of me. There's different expectations for different students. I don't understand. All the expectations are invisible. And you may feel as mentor that you've been very clear about expectations, but you may have delivered those expectations verbally. You might have delivered those expectations early on in the relationship when in fact the mentee felt they were kind of drinking from a fire hose. And having something written down allows you to have uniformity across your relationships. And it also allows you to level the playing field, because some mentees will come to you socialized to the experimental research enterprise. They will have past experiences or know people or have family members or friends that can help them understand what the unspoken expectations are of working in research. Others will come to you without that knowledge. And therefore, there's not a level playing field simply in knowing what questions to ask about expectations, let alone all of the things people figure out on their own. So I wanted to ask what your own experience is with using a mentoring compact. And again, this is in no way to say you should or shouldn't be using one, but simply your familiarity with using them. So this will be our last poll question for today. Give folks another 30 seconds, maybe 20. Got about 75% voting. All right. So a large fraction have never heard of the compact. About 20% of you have heard of it but have not seen one. About 13% have seen it but haven't used it, and looks like a couple people have used one as a mentor-mentee. For those who have used one, could you share with us in the question window what your experience has been in terms of using one, if it's been helpful, if you've had mixed feelings about using it, if you haven't liked using it. We'll just give you a little bit of time to type that because it'd be great to hear from the community. So Carmen, you've used one and found it very helpful. Great. All right, I think there might be one more person, but I'll keep watching in case that person shares as well. So what I thought would be helpful is, since many of you have not used one or seen one, is to give you some example domains to consider in a compact and then walk through an example with you. And examples of mentoring compacts will be made available to you via a link that I will share with David and he can post on the website. Oops, sorry. So when I talk about a mentoring compact, here's some domain examples that might be in it. You might have a section on what I expect from you as the mentee. You might expect them to take ownership of their own experience, that they'll develop their personal research skills while they work with you, that they'll contribute to the department or the unit or the lab. And then you'll probably have a section about what they can expect from you, that you will encourage them to advance along their career path. You'll be available to them. You'll provide timely feedback. You'll provide a space that's supportive and safe and free from harassment. You also can get very specific in a compact about, what about our individual meetings? What can you expect? What about group meetings? How should we communicate? Who's responsible for reaching out? Will we have a regular evaluation? This is just a sampling of the kind of domains. There are many examples of compacts. Some of them are very... Oh,
can I jump in and say, we can't see your slides right now. I don't know if you're showing.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I forgot to hide that last poll. There you go. So thank you so much. So yes, so these are the things I just spoke of some domains of what they could expect from you, what you could expect from them, and nuts and bolts. Thanks again, David, for pointing that out. So some compacts can be very short, very simple. Some can be very long as they develop over time. I have one colleague whose compact is 6 pages long because every year she invites all members of the lab to talk about expectations that were not clear and were not currently in the compact. And they collectively talk about issues that came up and whether or not they should be addressed in the compact. You can implement a compact very top down and kind of say, this is a compact we're going to use with the group. You can show examples to your lab if you have a lab and have them weigh in on whether they think it's a good idea. One really interesting exercise can be to ask members of your lab, if you were starting here again for the first time, what do you wish you had known when you came? What was unclear to you in the first 6 months that could have been helpful if we had written it down? So these can be really interesting team building experiences if you decide to implement it that way. So let me share one example with you and make sure you can see it. There we go. Great. So this is an example of a mentee compact that's really focused on an undergraduate mentee. It is from Entering Research, which is the facilitator manual I shared a slide showing earlier with the URL of activities that you can access. So this is a very straightforward, but I think very powerful compact. The mentor and mentee simply put their names on it, and it basically says this contract or compact outlines how we're going to work together. What are our goals? This is all about shared vision. What are our research project goals? What are your personal goals? What are my personal goals? And our shared vision of success is this. And we're going to agree to work together for at least X semesters, X weeks. You would change it based on your situation. And the mentee is going to work at least X numbers of weeks on the project. So in the summer, this could be full-time, but during an academic year, one of the things, especially with early undergraduates, is really getting on the same page about how many hours they're going to come in and commit to. So moving on is on a daily basis, here's how we'll communicate, and you can have them circle. It could be face-to-face, on the phone, email, instant messaging, whatever you think would be a means of communicating regularly. You can lay out, you're going to meet one-to-one, and this is how often we're going to reaffirm our goals. We're going to meet for this many minutes, this many times per month. And this is one that gets people really tripped up, is whose responsibility is it to schedule the meeting? We have many mentees who say, well, my mentor didn't email me to set that up. And then we often encourage mentees, say, no, that's your responsibility. But to right up front, say, here's whose responsibility it is. And here's how you're going to prepare. Are you going to come with an agenda, a list of questions? Are you going to come with an update on your work? Are you going to come in with some slides? And how's the mentor going to prepare? And at these meetings, the mentor is going to provide feedback on performance and suggest how to improve. And are you going to provide a written evaluation, a verbal, or something else? Another thing you can address is if the mentee gets stuck, what should they do? Should they ask a senior person in the lab? Should they look it up themselves first and then come for help? Should they come to you? Now, these may seem like things that might be obvious, and may be obvious maybe to grad students or postdocs, although I would argue they're not, but especially to undergrads, is some of these things which we're socialized to really are not clear. And being able to just lay these out can really lower their stress and also get you on the same page. And also hopefully lower your own frustration when you're not sure why things aren't moving forward. So another thing is that if you don't like the compact idea, is you can certainly just have a series of set questions that you work through with each mentee. So in this case, this is a tool that is also in the intern research curriculum, where students are just articulating their motivations and goals for doing research and what they bring to the experience. So you're simply having them come to a meeting to talk about why they want to do research, what are their goals, what are their values and experiences, what are they concerned about, what are they happy about. And you can use this as a way to get to know them and start off on the right foot. You can also answer these questions yourself. Is what got you into research? What are you concerned about in terms of working with them? Why do you want to mentor them? So a lot of these tools can be really useful in helping launch that experience and then revisiting it over time. So I'll pause here and see if there's any questions or comments just about these specific tools for aligning expectations. And again, this is just one tool, but it is one that we find that many mentors and mentees find very helpful in making sure they're on the same page. So I'll just give us a minute if folks have questions or comments. It's always so hard on a webinar because I can't read any body language. All right, so don't see any. So I'm going to actually end there with some acknowledgments to colleagues as well as APS members. I'm going to turn it back over to David. I left us a good 5 or 6 minutes here at the end for him both to remind folks about the APS National Mentoring Community and the resources that are published. And also if folks have additional questions, we'd be happy to take them at this time by you sharing them in the question window. So David, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Chris. Thank you very much. That was very interesting for me, and I hope it was for the rest of you as well. Before we wrap up, I did want to do a quick plug and tell you a little bit about the benefits of signing up with the National Mentoring Community as a mentor. I think many of you have not yet signed up. In addition to these webinars, we have other forms of communication and support that we provide to mentors and to mentees, including monthly emails with topics and resources for you to discuss with your students. We have an annual conference, which will be in California this fall. And there's an emergency fund for any student mentees of yours who might need some extra financial support to help them get through the semester and make sure they don't drop out. Even if you don't have a student mentee right now who is from an underrepresented group, you can still register with us, and you should. because you might have such a student mentee in the future, and we can also sometimes help you to get one and connect with one. The link that's there on the slide you're looking at, it might not be clickable from where you are right now, but it's hopefully easy to remember. bit.ly/NMC Mentor. So please check that out. Also, we'll include that when I send an email announcing the resources soon. So please check that out. And again, it is a free program, so I encourage you to sign up. This is all the time we have for today. Actually, we have a few more minutes, but I think we're going to wrap up unless there are some burning questions you might have. But we do welcome you to follow up either with me or with Chris on any remaining questions you might have. A recording of today's presentation and a PDF of the slides will be made available, as well as the other resources that were mentioned. I'll make sure they're available on the NMC website in the coming days, where there are already some resources from the last two webinars we had. You may be interested in looking at those. So please check back. There's a link on the main page of the NMC website that will take you to a page about these webinars. So we hope you can join us for our conference this fall. And in the meantime, thank you for joining us very much, and I hope you have a great summer. I do see the one comment says thank you. All right. Thanks, everyone. I think we'll close it out now, but please be in touch. Take care.